The X-Men film franchise is dead, and I am here to dissect its bloated corpse. Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're going to count down the top 10 worst things about the X-Men films. Now I do want to note I do have a lot of love for the majority of this franchise, and there's only 2 movies out of the entire thing I really hate. Most of this list doesn't really apply to the better, overall quality X-Men films. That most especially refers to Logan, which is very different from the rest of X-Men's film franchise, and therefore a lot of what we're going to talk about doesn't apply to it. And even Deadpool and a lot of the other X-Men movies that are particularly good, like X2, Future Class, and fan favorite Days of Future Past. We aren't here to talk about good or positive things that I like about this franchise. I'm here to tear this motherfucker apart, and let's get to it. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Comic Island for all sorts of cool comic book videos. Number 10. Direction. In general, a lot of the X-Men movies don't have good directors to begin with. And these mediocre directors have a lot to do with not getting good cast performances out of the franchise. The directors of Final Stand, X-Men Origins, Wolverine, and Dark Phoenix were all pretty lousy. But the real obvious issue in all of this is Bryan Singer, who I've been dancing around up until now, a mediocre director out of those that had a chance to work with the X-Men movies, and is a genuine monster not deserving having directed all these movies at all. The last part obviously awful, but isn't a huge part of the actual X-Men movies, though it does weigh on them whenever his name shows up in the credits of all these films. Number 9. Budget and technology. This one is also low on the top 10 because some aspects of it were legitimately out of Fox's control. It's not their fault the X-Men movies came out relatively early in comic book film history, and thus some of these older effects don't look quite as good as they would if they were made today. That isn't their fault at all. If anything, they deserve credit for being real pioneers in the history of comic book film. What is their fault is that they would go on to slash some budgets so severely over time that certain effects would look worse than the earliest X-Men movies. Look, I'm not a huge stickler about effects, but even stuff like the most recent X-Men movies have been a problem in this regard. They never look great, they always look a little dated, and at the end of the day I just don't like the look of X-Men Apocalypse or Dark Phoenix, for example. Both of these movies have an awful lot of scenes with very obvious effects that took me right out of the movie, which is a shame when I think about how well done other scenes were, like the early content in Apocalypse involving Magneto. I guess the real shame of it all is that defenders of Fox's time with the X-Men should probably note that if Fox had been more willing to take a bigger risk and invest a little bit more time, money, and energy in producing these films, well, maybe there would still be a real Fox Studios to begin with. Number 8. Death. Almost every single one of these X-Men movies have a bad habit of killing off a lot of characters. There are a lot of things wrong with this, even when it's done right on other occasions. For comic book fans, this is all old news. Characters die, they come back. Sometimes there's an explanation for their return, sometimes Professor Xavier possesses a dude in a coma who apparently looks exactly like him. But we all know the problem with this. These deaths become meaningless over time, to the extent by Dark Phoenix it's all a joke. What's even sillier is just how short-sighted it all was. They were killing off characters as far back as the first X-Men movie, and never really stopped. Granted, these movies came out initially at a time where the idea of a cinematic universe wasn't a real thing, but due to the nature of copyright law, Fox knew they would have to keep making X-Men movies in some form or another to hold on to the rights. So at a certain point you'd think they would have learned a lesson or two and maybe thought a little bit about how they worked with their characters, and maybe not kill Emma Frost and a bunch of other characters off screen between First Class and Days of Future Past. It's just a thought. That sort of nonsense cheapened the brand over time, slowly wearing down interest and excitement, as all your favorite X-Men characters would die off one by one, only for them to randomly, and often with goofy or complicated explanations, or no explanation at all, bound to return. Number 7. Poor use of the cast. Very few of the X-Men, in my opinion, were miscast. Some decisions were inspired. There are examples of that in every single one of these X-Men movies. However, many also fail to effectively use this effective casting. The real all-time Hall of Famer example of this has to be Ryan Reynolds' first appearance as Deadpool. That has been properly dressed down by actual Deadpool movies at this point. Academy Award winner Halle Berry was sadly wasted across all her appearances as one of the coolest comic book characters ever because of this. I'm not blaming the cast either. I think Fox exerted a lot of power over these films, and as such would spend a lot and indulge a lot with casting without there really being intention for these characters built into the script. Additionally, a lot of these stories weren't great to begin with, and nobody would sound good delivering some of these lines.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
Number 6. Writing and superpowers. Movies, to me, are supposed to be this vicarious escape, so superhero content is a very strong candidate for making an entertaining movie. That's why I'm all for them kind of being their own genre unto themselves at this point in the film industry, so long as the film studios get into their head that superhero content can basically be any genre to begin with. The shame of it all is how often these movies seem to shy away from really showing off these powers. That could range from X-Men using them to help with their day-to-day life in little ways, which we get but not nearly enough in these movies, to them using their powers in epic battles, which we get but not nearly enough in these movies. Superpowers are there across the 12 X-Men movies and are used well sometimes, just in my opinion not quite enough. These powers are often used and shown off inconsistently, where often a character could easily solve a problem but doesn't. Sometimes this is fine. Movies can be excellent and get by using a sort of flawed logic or playing up the underdog aspect of a character. Once again, Logan is a good example of this done right. Yeah, his powers were kind of dying out even at the start of the movie, but that's the point of the movie. Other movies like Days of Future Past maybe aren't using all the characters' powers to the full effectiveness at any given moment in the film, but it's entertaining enough on its own that really doesn't matter. The whole Quicksilver dilemma really doesn't bother me too much. He shows up when he wants to and otherwise is not like a core part of the team. That works for me. The problem is that something has to be written into these stories every time to scale back their powers and make it so that they can't use them all the time to solve all these problems, and the writing kind of has to dance around that. And yes, while the X-Men are indeed very powerful, the comics are full of examples of how you can write to that power level. It's hard writing to get a great X-Men story. Sure, it's not easy, but decades of comics are literally full of blueprints for how it can be done with these specific characters. And by not doing that, it feels particularly frustrating. And actually, that leads us right into number 5, watering down the comics. I don't consider myself a comics purist by any extent of the imagination. I absolutely am in agreement with the need for movies to adapt comic book material in little ways in order to better adapt to the needs of filmmaking. But none of that really feels like it applies to a lot of the X-Men movies. Instead of them offering an actual adaptation of the X-Men comics, as in taking something and putting their own spin on it to better suit the films, these changes seem much more related to scaling things back, better suiting a budget, better suiting Hollywood sensibilities, and just taking away the magic of the comics by watering everything down. And yes, it's obviously done because it's cheaper that way and easier to film. Beyond that, it has to do with the desire to overly simplify things for a general audience. And there's a bit of an ego thing going on too. The people and the directors behind the X-Men movies and Hollywood in general often assume they have a better sense of how to do things than the stories highlighted in the comic books. And while there are plenty of examples of that being true across the general history of film and the world of comics, thanks to lackluster choices with the directors over the years, there's never really been a case for that in the X-Men movies except for one example. Instead, the end result is stories that are different for the sake of being different, that are just less exciting than the normal ones we might get out of any comic, and made more generic to better fit the model of Hollywood films going back decades. Take the Danger Room, a cool and fun part of X-Men lore we've probably seen less than a few minutes of across a dozen X-Men movies. Colossus is a fun character who at this point has appeared in quite a few X-Men movies. In the comics, he's a complex guy with a long history and deep friendships among various X-Men. If you were just going by the movies, you'd tell me that he was a Deadpool character. The X-Men have a huge and diverse roster of villains, and we've seen live-action versions of like 3 of them. Any one of these things would be fine on their own, to a degree. Let's not pretend that other film studios out there haven't completely lived up to the comics in the past. But with the X-Men, it feels like it's happened over and over again, even in the best of their movies, and over time, that's led to them all kind of feeling like the same thing over and over again. Number 4. Unfocused writing. Even a movie I at least somewhat like, such as Apocalypse or Dark Phoenix, really feel like they're often sprawling messes with weird scenes and moments that don't flow with the overall film. The writing doesn't ever seem to have a strong sense of identity outside of gems like Logan or Deadpool, which very much do. Those movies understand that the X-Men are a lot more than just a generic sense of action and adventure the rest of the film franchise came to be defined by. The people behind Logan and Deadpool understood that the X-Men comics are full of romance, sci-fi, horror, drama, and all sorts of other genres and ideas. And you don't have to use all of them at once either, but if you have a strong sense of direction and what you want to go for among that huge umbrella of stuff, in Deadpool's case they went for comedy, in Logan's case they definitely went to the dramatic direction. With every other movie, we only ever get a hint of what tone and direction they're going for, and they often suffer for it. Each of these other 9 movies really resemble the other far too much to have this distinct flair that could have ever sustained itself long term. You want different, attractive properties where someone can tell you a little bit about each film in an excited way. But because they all jump between darkness and the rare joke, followed by more darkness, followed by generic action, most of the X-Men movies all seem like the same vaguely defined thing. And I think that has a lot to do with number 3, studio tinkering. Big movies are always a bit of a negotiation between different forces. The MCU has no shortage of these moments in their history, but they've managed to navigate them and produced a pretty consistent level of quality in terms of their film. While the X-Men movies certainly have had their moments, they've really struggled historically with that level of quality control. And often it seems like the studio is most involved with their most problematic movies. It's the studio that feels very much responsible for this.
You're X-Men.
Or this. And even truly sloppy moments like this.
Stryker finally figured out how to shut you up.
To be fair, the X-Men movies very much pioneered comic book film adaptation, especially in the modern age. The world of Hollywood has always struggled with adapting the world of comics consistently. The way they do things making movies simply doesn't mesh well with how comic book stories are told, and certain studio habits, or what they look for in greenlighting a story, often don't fit well with the sensibilities and spirit of superhero stories within comics. Even now, it is still a struggle between various studios adapting these different characters, though obviously we have quite a few successful examples by now, including some X-Men movies, and to be fair, we can credit the growing success of movies in adapting comics in no small part to the X-Men movies in general. But in those early days, and even late into the game, studio politics always informed a great deal of decisions and weighs on even the best of the X-Men movies. I think the best example of this is Mystique's character, not just her time as Jennifer Lawrence, but across all of her film appearances. Both in her early days as Magneto's lackey and then later as Xavier's weird little sidekick thing, it has nothing to do with this complex character with difficult motivations who's often working on her own and building her own schemes and plans in the comics. But because she was cast by Jennifer Lawrence early on in that woman's career, she ends up being built into the X-Men team and then unceremoniously killed off in the Dark Phoenix. It even tells us why popular characters like Storm or Nightcrawler never really got to take center stage, while others hog the spotlight over and over and over again. Number 2. Magneto, Xavier, and Wolverine. This holy trinity of X-Men characters basically carry all the weight of the non-Deadpool X-Men movies, and it's very frustrating. I understand why to a degree. These 3 characters are played by 5 of the most prolific and talented actors across the entire franchise. And Wolverine is very, very popular, so I get why he gets his own movies. But the X-Men are so much more than that. Yes, I understand why Logan has his own time in the spotlight, but where's the same love for the other big names? Gambit was barely used in one of the worst X-Men movies, and his studio film was supposed to have come out years ago but never got out of development. Storm has been in a ton of these movies but has never really gotten to do anything. A thing that Halle Berry correctly pointed out, so they sort of stapled her onto Wolverine's story in The Last Stand. How fun. It's amazing how little of these awesome X-Men characters have been completely wasted across these movies. I need you all to really reflect on what I'm about to say. Pyro got more screen time and character development than almost every major X-Man out there, other than the big 3, Iceman, Shadowcat, Rogue, Jean Grey, Beast, and Cyclops. That's it. These movies are a mess. Number 1. Fear of Joy. The X-Men are in a weird spot in terms of their role in comic book film history. They very much contributed to a lot of how these movies kind of look and feel in the modern age. And they did a great job in bringing the audience around to a world where you can have a steady stream of successful comic book movies coming out multiple times in a year. What I'm saying is I do understand to a great deal the value these X-Men movies had in taking themselves seriously and not being full of MCU-style jokes peppered into them. What I do mean is that a little bit of fun or humor can go a long way and would have wildly improved virtually every single one of the X-Men movies except for Logan, and we'll talk about that in a minute. This little scene is a great example of what I'm talking about. It's literally the most praised moment in all of X-Men The Last Stand, a bad movie without a lot of value in it that I've referred to a few times for a reason now. But this moment is funny. It's a cute little bit that works well and diffuses an otherwise very tense situation after a lot of beloved characters have just died. What doesn't work is the dated internet reference, which was already old news back when the movie first came out.
I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
The Quicksilver scenes are another great example of the kind of fun I'm talking about here too. Those scenes aren't necessarily funny, although they do have funny moments, but they aren't really supposed to be laugh out loud funny. What they're supposed to be is fun. And again, that really stands out in Days of Future Past and Apocalypse, in part because it's kind of the only fun moment in both of those movies. Now, I haven't mentioned Logan or Deadpool much because those movies handle joy perfectly. Deadpool's movies are infested with joy, and that's why I love them so much. Logan's kind of the opposite of that coin, and out of all the X-Men movies, it takes itself the most seriously, and to its benefit. That's because it's going for something very different and succeeded in that regard. I'll say it right now, if any of the other X-Men movies were nearly as good or as carefully made as Logan, they wouldn't need as much joy in them because the tone and goals of those movies would suddenly be very different. That being said, let's not pretend there wasn't any bits of fun or humor in Logan either. In fact, what works so well about Logan is that it uses joy very purposefully and at key moments to really take you along on an emotional journey. Sure, this isn't a movie that's meant to fill you with happiness, but it uses these moments of joy to really keep you from feeling miserable or depressed throughout the entire thing, which would have made the movie feel dragged out and not nearly as powerful. It also uses it to really, rip your heart out. As for the rest of the X-Men movies, in comparison, humor and fun will come and go at random times, with that joy lacking any sense of purpose, and fun characters getting downplayed a great deal across all of these movies. Let's never forget what Fox's original instincts were regarding Deadpool, or the fact that they were basically put under enormous pressure to make the first Deadpool movie to begin with. At the end of the day, Fox rarely opted for fun choices, characters, or storylines, And because of that, they would take these top-shelf, well-regarded X-Men stories and strip all the joy and fun out of them. I'll remind you, this is supposed to be a story about a school, and while I applaud the X-Men for tackling bigotry in a big way throughout their movies and making those connections to acceptance in very obvious ways, which, sometimes needs to be spelled out for a general audience. And it is worth giving them credit for nailing some serious character moments throughout these films. What works about the X-Men, and in particular these big dramatic action stories, is that the losses are felt in the comics because they contrast so heavily with the joy seeing these students experience a school where they're all accepted together, having these moments of peace before everything goes horribly wrong. You can have darkness in these films, and I would never ever invite these movies to bring in an MCU level style of humor. But having some level of joy in some form is so important and rarely followed up on in these X-Men movies. I'm reminded of that big mall scene that was supposed to feature Jubilee that just got wiped out of X-Men Apocalypse, because it's a great example of Fox avoiding the exact type of content that very much felt needed across all of the X-Men movies severely. You can get away with changing a lot, or even pulling back from comic book content quite a bit, and still make a good movie. It's that emotional arc that really matters the most, and in my opinion, is what the X-Men movies most had a problem with outside of Logan. I really don't know what we can expect out of the future of these characters, or what Marvel plans to do with them. Personally, I believe that their entry into the world of Marvel is going to have to be a big deal, and that Marvel won't just go with them just saying that mutants were on their world all along and nobody had mentioned them until now. I think we're in for a Secret Wars style recreation of the world. We'll see how all that pays off, but for now we're going to move our top 10 series in a different direction as I take a look at the Arkham game series and its totally awesome apparent future.